Question. The member from Toronto Danforth.
Thank you, Speaker. My question to the Premier. Rural Ontarians now pay the highest hydro rates in all of Canada and the continental United States. I think the Premier heard some disappointment at the ploughing match on this issue. Over the summer, Francesca Dobbin, the Executive Director of the United Way of Bruce Grey, declared rural energy poverty to be a crisis. But the Minister of Energy refused to call this a crisis. In fact, he said he didn't know how many Ontarians were behind on their electricity bills, or even if the province collects such data. Well, it does. About 567,000 households were behind on their bills as of December 31st, 2015, up by about 94,000 households from 2013.
Question.
How many families are in arrears right now?
Wow.
Thank you. Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member for the question, because I think the important thing to recognize there are 330,000 families in this province that live in the rural areas that are going to be getting this benefit that we introduced in our three-part pillar plan. Mr. Speaker, $110 million in additional funding in support for rural and northern customers, Mr. Speaker, as well as increasing access for these families. We're seeing their bills drop, Mr. Speaker, by on average $45 a month, or over $500 a year. And Mr. Speaker, that's on top of, Mr. Speaker, it is so important to emphasize that we've got the OESP program in place. We've got many other things for families in Northern Ontario and rural areas, Mr. Speaker, that I understand that some of them are having difficulty. I live in the North, Mr. Speaker.
Answer.
I hear from them, and we've ensured that we've put this in place because we heard what they're saying, and we're continuing to act and help these families, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Speaker. To the Minister of Energy. About 60,000 Ontario families were cut off from their electricity in 2015.
Terrible.
The minister doesn't blame rising hydro rates. He blames the families. In rural Ontario, when you lose your electricity, you don't just lose your lights. You could also lose power to your well pump. It means you lose drinking water. It means you lose your shower and your toilet. This happened to a 74-year-old pensioner in MacArthur Mills this summer. She was not the only one. Instead of blaming families, will the minister guarantee that rural Ontarians who can't pay their skyrocketing hydro bills don't lose access to the basic necessities of life?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And we're continuing to work with the OEB on finding ways that we continue to help and look at distribution costs and many things to help rural families, because I know, Mr. Speaker, as a government, we are well aware that rural families are paying a disproportionate more for the supply of electricity into the areas. That's why we've brought forward this 20% reduction, Mr. Speaker. That's why I had the opportunity to meet with the United Way Executive Director in Bruce County. We had a very good meeting to ensure that we could talk about all the programs that are benefiting and helping rural families, Mr. Speaker. But I find it interesting, Mr. Speaker, that we're doing everything we possibly can to ensure that the aggressive timeline to pass this legislation that I introduced last week, Mr. Speaker, that we want to get this done so we can ensure families get this rebate, Mr. Speaker. But unfortunately, when I asked for unanimous consent to pass it, the opposition voted against it, Mr. Speaker.
Your question.